Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Leia Charnin. I am indeed named after Star Wars and Princess Leia. My mom saw the movie back in the 70s. Here I am. So for those of you who are, yes, indeed. For those of you who are familiar with Southeast Psych, we are actually covered with superhero characters too. The premise is that each person has their own inner superhero power. Mel and I were just talking about creativity. That could be something. Maybe it's a matter of being able to engage people warmly, or the superpower of listening. Really thinking about how we all have strengths within ourselves. So that connects really nicely actually to the topics that we'll be talking about today, which is related to our growth mindset and also self-compassion. I'm talking about those two concepts because it's related and it's a positive psychology term. What that means is it's really leaning into how do we look at the strengths that we have and implement them day to day when we are faced with challenging situations. So it's a topic that I'm very passionate about. I am a therapist. I work a lot with teens and families, do a large presentation in terms of depression, anxiety, and trauma work are kind of my sweet spots. But as you might imagine, it's not as clean cut, and there oftentimes are overlapping themes as we all have day-to-day stressors. We all have families, loved ones we worry about, and even our own internal critical voice, which I'll be speaking to more in just a moment. I am going to engage you in a couple of exercises during this conversation today because, let's face it, it's late at night. Maybe practicing and engaging is going to be a little more learning in producing than just listening to me spew off facts for 50 minutes. So with that being said, and with the exercises, I'm going to encourage you to, if you don't already have it, have some paper and a writing utensil with you. Please feel free to take a moment to grab that. You could even use your cell phone or write computer device in front of you, but I find that we feel more connected to writing when we're doing handwriting. It slows down our thought processes more, creates a little more intimacy within our emotional processes too. So I'll invite you to have that paper. Okay, I'm also going to shift over to the screen share. All right. So I speak with a lot of metaphors in my work. You'll see the lotus flower, and sometimes people are like, oh, that's a little cliche, but here's the reason I chose it. The lotus flower, especially in Buddhist beliefs, is this idea of within mud, within this really thick dirt and muck below the water, we need that nutrients from the mud in order to have this lotus flower bloom. So this is a metaphor for also with our suffering. How do we lean into that to respond to ourselves with compassion and gentleness, to see the ways in which we can grow? They made the metaphor work pretty well here. So it's also a beautiful picture, but the lotus is very intentionally there. And as we move forward, and I'm going to ask everyone just to double check that their mics are muted. I'm getting just a little bit of feedback, so that would be wonderful if you can double check that, please. Okay, so I'm briefly going over some broad goals. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about compassionate and mindset. These are two separate constructs that are often overlapping, and I'll speak to how these interact with each other. I want to talk about learning ways that we think and talk to ourselves, because sometimes it can be limiting in terms of how it affects our behaviors. Therapists talk a lot, and the stereotypes are true. We talk about our emotions, we talk about our feelings, right? Our behaviors and our thoughts. It's kind of like this triangle. If you were to think about this interaction of how are we feeling in a certain moment, then what does that do to our thinking pattern? And how does that influence our behaviors? So for example, I'm feeling really happy being with my friends. That makes me reflect on how much I appreciate connection. That's the thought. So then I want more of that. So I'm going to hang out with my friends more. Right now, this has been really challenging. So I have this thought of how much I miss my friends. And then I have this feeling of sadness. And then I might have a behavior, depending on different individuals, of withdrawing or reaching out. And so depending on how we respond to our emotions and thoughts, we have these different behaviors that might be helpful or unhelpful. So the role of the therapist is we're really talking about what are we leaning into that's going to be helpful for us. And that's what I'm going to try to teach you with some of these skills and concepts today. To also increase effective communication both within your own mind. So think about that for a second. Our own dialogues and also with other individuals, because we do have a relationship with ourselves. So this is going to be activity number 1. Let's think for a moment. And of course, speaking to a school and thinking about grades, I had to nerd out and provide a normal distribution image. That's the research nerdy side of me. But for a moment, let's talk about ways in which we are maybe a little perceiving ourselves as below average, average, and above. I'm going to throw out this caveat that average is not necessarily, oftentimes we associate average with the stereotype, this belief system that it's a negative thing. Yet we all have things in which we grow. So skills in which we're not as skilled. Like for example, I've been trying to be a faster runner my whole life. Comparatively speaking to many other humans in my life, I'm not so fast. However, there's still ways I can grow. I've been able to increase my distance. Am I ever going to run a 7-minute mile? No. So I might be perceived as a little below average there, and that's okay for me. The average qualities that we have, and then above average, and so the things in which we're proud of. So the activity I'd like to ask you to do for just a few minutes is list a few traits that are culturally valued. What I mean by that is typically these are traits that society says, hey, this is important, like fitness, or being perceived as friendly, or being perceived as someone who is really competent, smart, intelligent. These are messages that society, maybe our families, peers, we believe are telling us that we have to be. And so, jot down just for a moment, maybe 3 to 5 traits in which you think you are above average. And notice the emotional experiences, maybe any thought reactions that you have. Perhaps this is challenging for you, and if it is, notice the response to yourself. By no means rushing you. Whenever you're ready for the next category, traits for which you are average or just average. And again, noticing any thoughts, beliefs that you have while writing these qualities. Even if there are any self-criticisms coming up, or if you're responding to yourself with gentle curiosity, just observing. And whenever you're ready to move on, last but not least, jotting down some traits for which you are below average. And noticing the reactions, maybe judgments, or thoughts that you're having as you're writing this information. We'll take just a few more moments. Okay, so for the sake of our time together, I am going to move forward. Please feel free to continue thinking about this if you'd like to add to it. I'm going to take this in the next step. For those of you who have video, can we share together, maybe raise your hands? Who noticed that this was maybe harder than you thought, that than you expected this to be. Did it bring up some emotional discomfort? And maybe any self-criticism, judgments? Yeah, yeah. I'll share some of the resources I'm taking these activities from at the end of our talk. As a therapist who drags people through these experiences, I have to do these experiences too. And it's always surprising me, like, man, there's a self-critical voice that is there. Because we learn these messages of the ways that we should be, need to be, through so many different resources in our lives. And it's not intentional necessarily when we go back to, what did we learn from our families? What have we learned from our peers? Or what have we internalized when we do social comparison? So for example, I talk a lot to the teens that I work with and adults, frankly, where we look at other people and reference, oh my gosh, they're so much better at this than I am maybe. Or we perceive other people as much more above average and capable, and we really downplay our own skills. We've learned this from a lot of external messages. And we'll take this in a moment, but the reason I wanted to get to this is because we're kind of bullies to ourselves. We are really our own harsh critics. And I've heard some arguments for saying, yeah, well, if I lean into that, it'll motivate me. I'm going to try to, I see you laughing, Mel. I love it. So, right. So there's some, and Carrie, yes, I see laughs all around. It's great. Okay. Right. So, okay, wait a minute. I'm going to try to put some holes into that, but it's going to take some time. So stay with me with this talk and see if we can get to that place. Why are we just so darn hard on ourselves? Because it does cause some angst and stress. Particularly, it changes our thought processes, alters our thinking with unhelpful thoughts. You'll notice I use the language of unhelpful because I want to really emphasize this. Is it helping you get to where you want to go? If not, then it's not serving you. If criticizing yourself is making you feel worse and it's not necessarily doing anything to help you in where you want to go, how do we change that self-critical talk? It's also going to bring up some physical discomfort. You notice, I don't know if you can see this, I'm holding my chest a lot. I do this a lot, especially if I'm feeling like connection, physical, anxiety, sadness. We feel emotions very physically. Have you all ever noticed, like when you are tearing up or feeling stressed, our throats get very tight, or we feel tension in our jaws? So we have these very physical experiences of stress, of feeling shame. I'll get to shame resilience in a minute. That's a big topic in mental health right now too. It also changes our behaviors. So it might reduce activity, or we might lean into unhelpful behaviors. So for example, if I'm feeling shame because I'm looking at someone, I'm like, wow, they are such good presenters. And good, how do I define that? They are quick thinkers. They have their information. They've done their research. And I think to myself, I don't got much to offer. I'm probably not going to be putting myself in a position of public speaking. This is kind of the imposter syndrome concept. We feel like we're not enough. We feel like we don't know enough or have enough to offer. And then that goes back into this idea of altering our emotional feelings, feeling sadder, feeling more upset, shame, and hiding. And so it kind of creates this self-perpetuating cycle of stress. I want to clarify, stress here can bring up any number of emotions, not just necessarily the sadness, right? It can bring up self-directed anger. It can bring up even guilt. And so these patterns of thinking really just are not serving us. And it can create a couple of other unhelpful behaviors. These are just some. And I encourage you to reflect on for just a moment, what are the behaviors that you sometimes notice in yourself when you're like, man, this is getting in the way of what I want? So for example, excessively seeking reassurance from others, particularly sometimes with decision making. When we perceive someone else as being more capable, we might externally go to another person as opposed to look towards ourselves. Micromanaging, especially if we're feeling really stressed, like we are feeling not enough, like I'm not doing enough. We might lean into micromanaging behaviors. We might lean into procrastination behaviors. I am not enough. I don't know what to say. I'm getting frozen and paralyzed. So we withdraw. That's an avoidance withdrawal behavior. Repeatedly double checking. I am so nervous, I'm going to screw something up or typo or something. I'm going to check over and over again. Refuse to delegate. That's refusing to ask for help. That's like, oh, nope, I am going to make sure that I'm tech checking stuff so much. I got this. I'm not going to ask for help. Or this might show signs of weakness if I ask for help. We have a number of different beliefs around these kinds of behaviors that draw that. So distraction or withdrawal oftentimes are types of behaviors when we're dealing with discomfort. So for example, I'll share. I know an unhelpful behavior for me that sometimes I catch, I'm like, why the heck did I do that? Is I'm a little micromanagey, especially in my home. And I snap at people. And like, especially when I'm feeling overwhelmed. And I'm like, why didn't you do this? Who? Okay. And I'm sitting here all day teaching people how to effectively communicate. And I just was like, not the nicest human, not to my values, right? But there's something else going on for me. And internally, and I will share that I have certainly struggled with my enoughisms, even with all the ways in which I've tried to overcompensate, with, for example, over preparing for presentations. That's historically been an issue for me. Thinking and double checking over and over again, did I cite these research sources? We all have these behaviors that are oftentimes because of the shame and the fears that we hold to. So if I were to lean into this really, really self-critical voice, that's going to not necessarily help me. It's going to make me lean into self-criticism. There is a lot of research right now. It's been kind of actually the past decade or so on self-compassion. And it's a way to increase emotional intelligence. So in understanding all emotional intelligence means is how do we understand our emotional experiences? So I'm checking in, I have this vocabulary for it, I understand and I'm mindful of what's happening for me emotionally, which could be mind and body. We talk about the mind-body connection and earlier the physical. It's associated also with improved quality of relationships because here's the thing. I'm so distracted by your dog. That's very cute. Okay, so anyways, here's the thing. When we are more understanding of our own emotions, we can communicate that more clearly to another person. So for example, when I said I snap at people of like, why aren't the dishes done? If I were to slow down for a moment, notice my own emotions, it's typically after I come home from work, I'm freaking tired, and I'm overwhelmed because there's all these other things that I have to do. So if I were able to just communicate first off saying, I'm feeling overwhelmed, and I'm saying this to myself, even before another person, saying, I'm feeling overwhelmed. Okay, Leia, what's going on for me right now? That's an example of that dialogue with myself. And then that's kind of that first step of opening up to the other person, the dialogue with, so the person with whom I live is my brother. So he's already someone I tend to like grew up snapping at and bickering at, right? But it might help give me pause to say, what is it that I can convey to him more effectively? So self-compassion, research does support that it is associated with improved quality of relationships and communication effectiveness. Growth mindset is also a similar concept. I'll differentiate in just a minute. It's actually related to increased workflow, motivation, and executive function. Growth mindset is really, really big in school curriculum right now, to my understanding, because it's about how do we lean into the power of enough or the power of yet. So I may not have gotten this, honestly, for me, be in chemistry. Chemistry was my hardest topic. I've never worked so hard for a C in a college chemistry class in my life, right? So gotta say, that was rough, but I continued trying because of my growth mindset of saying, okay, if I continue, I am willing to study, I'm willing to look at the effort and not give up. That was leaning into the growth mindset of I'm not there yet. I don't understand this concept yet, but I'm a pretty smart person in other areas of my life. Maybe I can get it, right? I was perseverant. So that illustrates that growth mindset, and it is associated with increased ability to stay focused. Executive functioning is this forefront part of our brain that's really sustaining attention and engaging in learning and memory. So let's talk about this. Oh, and is associated with reduced emotional intensity. So the growth mindset, if it's tapping into reduced shame response, then if we're not feeling as much shame, We're not going to feel as intense emotionally in the negative ways. So that outburst, the frustration, engaging in the unhelpful behaviors. Okay, so if I haven't sold you yet, it's time for another activity. Okay, so this one's going to be a little more maybe vulnerable. I try not to do too vulnerable here, but if you're willing to go there with me, then you're going to imagine this internal voice for just a moment. And think about an issue that you're struggling with in your life. Maybe something not too intense, but something that could be relational, work-related, maybe with your children, maybe with yourselves. And just think about that issue for a moment. So I'll share my example. With COVID-19 and gyms closing, I've had a very challenging time physically. Like, I typically like going to the gym. It's a way of me staying motivated, my own physical self-care, but I haven't been exercising as much, and I have gained the COVID weight that I think some of us have been talking about. I feel like I've gained the freshman 15 again, just like 16 years later. So that being said, okay, if I were to take that issue and let's try to think about the criticizer voice. This is a voice that is going to bully you, that is going to say, I hate that you're such a wimp, that you've been so lazy. That's leaning into this idea of that you aren't enough. So my self-criticizer voice to not exercising as consistently might be, I'm lazy, I'm not motivated enough. Trying to think of the other things that might come up to me. I lean into the frustration with myself, right? I'm thinking about that for a moment and how that feels. And even I knew I was giving this example, I was prepared, and even that feels vulnerable for me to say. Right? That taps into a very vulnerable place for us. But as we said earlier, as we were doing that exercise for our traits, that criticizer comes up very naturally because of our social learning. So next, let's think about a criticized voice. This is kind of this place of looking at it from a more compassionate leaning into that. So for example, the criticized place might feel, this is empathy, feel unsupported, feel hurt, feel scared or helpless, feel a need to withdraw. My criticized voice might say, I'm feeling shame. I'm not criticizing myself for feeling shame. It's just, it's there. Ooh, that doesn't feel great, right? It's there. Okay. Now, if we're to move into a compassionate observer voice, imagine what that compassionate voice would sound like. So let me give you some guidelines for compassion. We'll go through these in just a couple of slides, so don't feel like you need to write down notes right now. But compassion is, how do I speak to myself with kindness? And whenever I'm teaching this to clients that I'm working with, the aha moment is when I say, would you speak to, like, how would you speak to a loved one? Would you speak to a friend, someone you really cherish, in that voice? So for example, would you use the criticizer voice to someone you really cherish? Would you say to someone, you're so lazy, I'm so embarrassed by you, I'm ashamed? Well, I hope not, right? For the sake of that relationship, that nurturing. Okay, so the compassionate observer is leaning in and saying, okay, I hear your shame, I hear your pain, and I am here for you, and I'm here to listen. That's the compassionate observer, is saying, okay, these emotions are there, and I don't need to lean into criticizing. Right? So think about for a moment what your compassionate observer might say to yourself with that issue that we first brought up. So for example, I'm here to help me. I'm here to support myself. I'm here to change the dialogue I've been having with myself for a very long time. I'm here to accept gently this pain and the struggle that I have. These are some of my words. Try to tap into words that you really connect to in your own voice. And this might be hard. And if it is, I encourage you, even after this talk, to take some time with it. But this isn't a one size fits all, and it's not a one and done. It's really a process. Okay. So this is one of my hopes to give you, that this compassion observer voice you have for yourself, you can also try to tap into giving to other people. How many of you have had some talks or listened to concepts about empathy? It's a pretty common, yeah, right? So empathy is just stepping into the emotional experience of another person. If I were in that position, I imagine I might feel X. So for example, I work with a lot of parents, and parents will ask me, are you a parent? And I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm a dog mom, but that doesn't count. So I'm not. However, if I were a parent, I could imagine how truly scary it is to worry about your child's safety, because I know what fear feels like. I could imagine how truly sad you are to see your children go through grief right now with not being able to be as connected with their friends, or not being able to celebrate graduations or go to dances, or the things they were really looking forward to, end of school plays, right? That they were really, really looking forward to right now. And there's grief. And so I might imagine what it's like as a parent to watch your children struggle with that. We all know what these core feelings feel like. And so that's the empathy. And so connecting to that in both yourself and other people helps us to tap into that compassionate observer. So this is when I said, don't have to take notes. I have a step-by-step. Okay. To water it down just a little bit, I mean, the first step is really mindfulness. I imagine at this point you all have heard some information about mindfulness, because it's really, really big. It is science-based and research-based. What I mean by that, well, let me start off by defining mindfulness, just in case. It's about being aware of the present moment. You have been mindful and practicing it this whole talk. When you are aware of what your emotional states were, your physical states when we were doing the past couple of exercises, is paying attention mindfully. When I wasn't as mindful about the talk and distracted, I saw Doug's dog, and then I was like, that's cute. Hey, Leia, bring it back to what I'm focused on, right? That's bringing it back to the mindful moment right here, right now, because I noticed, hey, brain, getting a little distracted. So mindfulness is what noticing, just here are my thoughts, here are my emotions, here I am in this present moment. Sometimes, especially when we're stressed, our brains goes into this like overreactive state, and the amygdala, the emotion center of our brain, really gets activated. And so when we do that and we go to the past and we think about the past, the emotions get really activated. What I mean by that is we tend to think about sadder, harder, scarier times when we think about the past. Not to say we can't think about pleasant times. It's just that's one of the reasons why, especially for stress now, when we think about the past, some sadness or those uncomfortable emotions can get activated. Or even anger. Like think about an argument you have with a significant other or someone in your family. You go to the past and you might forget about the things that make you connected, because you're so focused on the things that are ticking you off, right? Like you said, and you get into that dialogue as opposed to what's happening for you right now, and you're missing an opportunity for connection. If we think about the future, we do tend to get more worried, anxious. So this is kind of a constant dance of, yes, we need to think about the future, of course. I do need to think a little bit, like yesterday I had to think about the stock and plan for it. I had to think about today. It's just a matter of how do we notice when and where we are, and if that's intentional and where we need to be in our minds. So that first step of that compassionate stance is mindfulness, is awareness. That's all that is, without judgment. And in order to have awareness and know where our mindsets are, we have to have mindfulness. So let's talk about growth mindset for a second. Growth mindset is really, okay, so there's this idea of fixed and growth. Carol Dweck wrote about mindset. Resources are all at the end of the slide too, so don't feel like you have to jot down names. Super interesting research, and she noticed these patterns that we tend to associate, such as fixed is this point of I have to have certain outcomes. So failure relates to my abilities. It relates to who I am, which is why oftentimes if we have this very fixed outcome mindset and we don't get that outcome, like I didn't get that B or A in chemistry, then when that happens, I would have internalized that with a fixed mindset of, okay, that means I'm just dumb. I'm bad at chemistry. I'm never going to try it again. Okay, I do have to put a caveat there. I didn't try chemistry again, but I didn't have to because of my major. So, but that being said, it didn't mean necessarily for me something about my abilities. But fixed mindset, we're so fused to that outcome, it can get to a very, very shameful place if that doesn't happen. It's black or white in some ways too. So I'm either good at it or I'm not. It relates to behavior. So if we say we don't like to be challenged, I'm not up for it, then we're not going to approach the challenge and see what we could accomplish. It's this idea of my potential is predetermined. So I have this ability, I have this grade, I have this outcome, and not much I can change. With growth mindset, this is the mindset, as you imagine, that's more associated with resilience, with anxiety management, with emotion regulation. So hard things still happen. Growth mindset is not saying, oh, I'm rosy and happy about everything that's happening. It's our mindset of what can we do next? So challenges help me grow. Okay, I got this grade on a test and it sucked and I'm not happy about it. What can I change next time? Or let me go back to my music background. I totally couldn't remember the music that I was supposed to have memorized for my recital and had to literally stop a piece and walk off stage. Like I even feel this in my gut right now. And this is like a 20-year-old memory, y'all. So challenges happen. It's also about how do they help us grow? What can I do next time so I don't blank out as much? For me, honestly, it was a bit of anxiety management. I really just needed to figure out how to learn that for myself. We see feedback as constructive, and then we like to try new things. Growth mindset is really an opportunity, and this is a way of how do we change our thought processes to lean towards growth mindset. One of the answers is that compassionate voice and observer. So to go back to, this is just another way to conceptualize fixed and growth mindset. Thinking about, I love this idea of think of learning as brain training. This is where we're starting to play with the language a little bit. So am I training my brain? Are there opportunities? Can I grow and learn as opposed to things are static? I feel like I explained this in full on the previous slide as well. So I'll give you just a moment to look at it. I forgot to say at the beginning of the talk too, if you have any questions throughout, please feel free to use the chat feature and I'll try to get it towards the end when we have questions too, okay? All right, so I'll move forward. So I've already given this statement before, but it's again to recapture, softening the critical voice. That in this space is a matter of, and I chose this image very intentionally, how do we connect that heart, the emotional space with our mind space? Where are our minds? Is there a way that I can engage the compassionate observer? Self-compassion, I don't have a slide for this one. So self-compassion is, and it's actually, this is the book I'm using. I have this in a reference side, but Kristen Neff has done a lot of research on self-compassion. She speaks about it in 3 constructs. One is kindness, and so that's kindness towards ourselves, which then perpetuates kindness to others, which that's why I talked about that kind inner voice. The second part is common humanity, so that empathy. We're all connected in this together. That's why we were talking about, if I know what fear feels like and you know what fear feels like, maybe like we can share in this experience together and I'm not so alone. When we feel more connected, we know that's a buffer for mental wellness. The third piece is actually mindfulness that she speaks about. So you see how this is all interconnected for self-compassion and softening that critical voice. I'll get to a few more tips about this in a moment too. Here are some phrases, just some helpful. I really liked this slide. Honestly, I found on Google, so I can't take credit for this one. But I really liked some of these alternative thought perspectives. So especially when we're looking at someone else who's struggling with their own mindset. So for example, he needs to learn some self-control. I've thought that about my brother, who I perceive to be very impulsive sometimes. And then to change it to he needs help with self-regulation. That one is interesting because it's, if we change that dialogue just a little bit to needs help, that could activate the mindset of how can I help maybe. you know, within the caveats of our own boundaries. But that, I know for me, can soften my perspective and frustration with my brother. She keeps giving me a hard time. Definitely had that thought with my mom. Oh, family systems is showing up right now, right? So she's having a hard time. How can I help? It's, again, that compassionate connection is here as well. These are just two different frames that are interrelated. His behavior comes out of the blue. Let's look deeper for patterns and setting events, right? So if we're very confused by what's going on for another person, it's about how do we lean into the deeper content, what they might be feeling or experiencing. How can I help? How can I connect and lean into this? I have a small caveat about this increasing curiosity. One of my very first clinical supervisors, and I remember she was a Chinese American, and she still had a very thick accent. I just hear it so clearly, and this was so many years ago. And she would tell me, she says, clinical curiosity. And just what she meant by that, this word just stay in my mind, was just how do we stay openly curious about our own internal experiences and that of another person, right? What is their story? Okay, this is out of the blue. Yet maybe something happened earlier in the day. Maybe there's a deeper emotion that this anger is covering up. Maybe it is sadness or shame. What other questions can we ask? Or does this person need space? Is that a way to provide kindness? And there's many different ways to provide kindness. So it's also this curiosity of what can help this person or what can help ourselves. Okay. So a couple more applications. So reframing the lens, so to speak. So this is going to sound a little sappy perhaps. However, I encourage you to try it out. A term of endearment for ourselves. When we go back to that self-critical voice, think about this for a moment. If you were to call yourself, like, even by your own name, like, hey, Leia, I'm here for me. Or another self-disclosure, my brother, his nickname for me is Poos because we watched a lot of Winnie the Pooh when we were kids. As an adult, it sounds a little less innocent, but you know, it's Poos. So that being said, if I say to myself, Poos, what's going on right now? That immediately taps in, especially if I'm frustrated with him, that taps in connection and love. It really does. I love my brother. It drives me nuts, but it really helps me to tap into that. Right? So I encourage you to find a term of endearment that really works for you. There are a couple of meditations from a different source that I have. They start off with terms of endearment like, darling, I'm here for you. For some people, that feels like a little too sugary sweet. So that's, again, why I encourage you to use your own language, or if that feels like something that you do connect to, I invite you to try it. Another piece is, okay, characters in your mind. My clients laugh at me really often when I do this, but if you were to imagine kind of a play in your head, like I try to do 2 anchor people, and especially with the critical voice and engaging the compassionate self. So for example, Karen, you'll never believe what my brain told me. It told me I was a worthless piece of ink. And then so that's clearly the critical voice. And then Karen might be the compassionate voice. Like, Susie, I hear you right now. What's going on? And if we play around with these voices, it actually, it brings a little humor and levity to it. I saw some smiles, right? I typically, again, my clients will definitely laugh at me on this one, and then we engage in it, and it does create some emotion change because we're just using a little bit of humor. It creates a little distance from that really deep emotional pain that we're feeling. So I invite you to think of some characters in your mind or ways that you might personify in some way what your inner critical voice sounds like, and then what that compassionate observer sounds like or looks like in kind of a play or characters. Mel, I bet you're loving that example. So the last one is, I'm thinking about gentle touch. Again, I spoke to this earlier, touching like one's chest or arm, a gentle hug. I actually invite you all to try that out for just a moment. Maybe even just closing your eyes, just feeling that touch for just a moment, what that feels like. You might even have some reactions to it, and just seeing if you can embrace that, feeling warmth, feeling skin and touch. Breathing into that. free to stay with that. I will continue. Touch is important because it does actually release cortisol in our brains. And so it reduces that stress hormone and it increases the pleasure hormones. And so touch, as we notice, especially when we're at a reduced emotional state. So you may have noticed, especially like when you're angry or frustrated, we don't want to be touched as much. However, if we provide that to ourselves, that can provide for a really different experience. And so it could be a grounding experience. Like if I'm really ticked off and I touch my arm, now that I'm saying this, I don't do this a whole lot. This is helping me, everyone. So thank you. So if I touch my arm or something, like I do feel more grounded. I do feel like, hey, lady, like what's going on for you here, right? So I encourage you all to think about how you might employ that as well. Okay. This is just another skill acronym therapy. We use a lot of different acronyms to try to do a shorthand, so to speak, of some of these skill sets. So RAIN is one of those acronyms. It's a mindfulness technique. So the first part is recognizing what's going on, just naming it, right? We said, okay, earlier, wow, that was hard to do that initial exercise where we looked at our traits and we talked about average and we noticed a critical voice. So just naming it, saying, whoa, buddy, that's there. And allowing it, feeling it, just saying that's okay, not necessarily pushing it away. I'm not saying sitting with it for like 5 hours. We're just saying recognizing it's there. We can have an opportunity to validate that. Being openly curious. Remember that clinical curiosity, right? Like that idea of what is it that I'm experiencing? What might have just happened? What has happened in my day, in my week, in my 2 months where I've been quarantined home, right? Just observing that. And okay, non-identification, let me explain that for just a moment. It means that we're not playing it over and over again. We're not like attaching it. So it's kind of a metaphor of like, if we're letting our critical thoughts really drag us along, we get really hooked, like a fish hook. So non-identification is saying, I'm not going to let this hook me. I'm not going to play this over and over and over again. I'm just going to say, I am having this thought, I'm having this emotion. It doesn't necessarily mean that I am this thing. So for example, I'm having the thought that I'm lazy because I haven't exercised as much as I tend to. That doesn't mean I am a lazy human. That is me trying to not over-identify with that thought. Okay. All right. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go over this slide as much because also it's really got a lot of text, but the general gists are creating a safe space, making sure, especially when we're leaning into this compassionate space with other people, timing is big. A lot of families I've talked to ask, well, my teen is really upset. I want to go talk to them right now. Give it some time. We all need some time. On average, 20 minutes to an hour to really reduce emotional intensity. So creating a safe time and a safe space, we can create this compassionate conversation in a much more effective manner. That's one of the keys that I take away from this. Keeping conversation going. Hey, like, when can I check in about this important topic again? Would you like to, or how would you like to check in about it? Would you rather come to me about it? That's typically with another person, or even making an agreement with yourself. How do I want to check in with me and my heart and what I need? When can I do that? Do I have a cue for that? I was talking to a client just this week and we talked about the idea of like having tea time with yourself, right? Like, can I create just some time and space for checking in? Being open, empathetic, acknowledging any, even if it's with a friend or someone else, like any cultural gender differences, what's going on. I think that's a really important piece because we all do have different styles of communication. Trying our darndest not to give like that advice giving. I know many of us want to lean into that. Sometimes, especially when we're just in that initial emotional state, we really just want someone to say, hey, I see you're having a hard time. What I like to encourage is asking, I have some thoughts for maybe next steps. Would you like to hear them? And then that just gives choice for the person to say yes or no. I'm in a space to hear that right now. My mom gives a lot of advice giving. She means so well. It drives me nuts. So I think that's where I've learned that skill for myself, right? To be able to say, okay, not right now. And she's been able to learn, can I check in about this? Okay. This was a little video. I'm not going to show it. It was intentionally at the end because you're welcome to go on YouTube and watch this adorable little video. I find teens really love this too. What it is it's about a 4-minute video. Brene Brown created it on the idea of empathy and differentiating that from sympathy and pity. This fox and bear go on this little journey. There's an antelope that gets hungry. There's a little like bite for you there. But the end of the day, the idea in the video just gets to this concept of I am here for you. How do we share in this experience together? I imagine many of you are familiar with Brene Brown's work. She's been quite seminal in compassionate work and shame resilience. She has a TED Talk that is really wonderful. It's about 20 minutes. It's one of the top 10 TED Talks. So I watch it really often, honestly, probably a couple times a year, because I find it's a nice reminder. So even if you have seen it, it speaks again to all these concepts of shame resilience, self-compassion, and being open-hearted, being vulnerable, and how hard it is. So that's why I want to take a moment to express appreciation to all of you who were willing to practice some of these exercises I threw at you. I know you didn't know you were signing up for that, and it tapped into some vulnerabilities. And so I really appreciate you leaning into that through this exercise. Okay. So let's take a moment for questions. And oh, wait a minute, I had one more tidbit I wanted to give you, actually. This is a loving kindness meditation. And so I'd like for you all to just take a moment as we're closing, maybe closing your eyes for a moment, leaning back into that touch, whatever's soothing to you, and saying to yourself these notions of, may I be safe. May I be peaceful. May I be kind to myself. May I accept myself right where I am. Repeating that back to yourself and noticing anything that comes up for you. Just connecting to your breath and your body and that touch. And whenever you're ready, you're welcome to open your eyes. These types of meditations, there are many, they can be very long, and they can tap into, again, some very emotionally deeper places. If we had more time, I was going to take you to the next wish, which is changing I to you. So that is then sending those well-wishings out to the people we love and care about. So that relates to both the self-compassion and the other compassion. Okay. All right, here's my resource page. So really what I pulled from, and I just realized one of the books that I use a lot, I didn't put up here, but the self-compassion, that's this one, Kristin Neff. She's the seminal person. It's a very digestible book. I really enjoy this and the exercises within it. Tara Brach, this is called Radical Acceptance. This is another type of self-compassion book. Carol Dweck is the big person on mindset. If you're more interested in doing the cerebral stuff, that's really the mindset, the self-dialogue changing, and also more so related to business, as you see they're parenting performance-based things, because mindset is really big in the performance literature. Okay, I'm going to move forward to, we have some questions in the chat boxes. I can absolutely send you copies of, I can send you the whole PDF, happy to. Okay, so tell you what, we have a few minutes left. Let me get to just my information slide. So again, I'm at Southeast Psych. I'm Leia. Feel free to email me really with any questions. I just realized I misspelled my email address. So it's Southeast Psych, not S-O-U-H-T. I don't know how you'd even pronounce that. So please make sure you write that down correctly and not in a dyslexic manner like I typed it. I recently did start an Instagram account. I just because, especially with some of the teens I'm working with and just adults in general, I am pretty focused on compassion and emotion focus. How do we normalize and validate? So I literally just started this out, but was hoping to just get some of this information out there in a very informal, interactive way. So please feel free to tap into that if you'd like to. So let's take a few moments. Questions, thoughts, reactions, or even, hey, disagreements. Not sure this is your thing. I'm totally open to any perspective here. You're welcome to use the chat box or to unmute and engage in conversation.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed this talk because I related to it so much. When you talked about using a term of endearment for yourself and the characters in your mind, I was like, I do that already. Because, I mean, my coworkers can tell you, when I talk to myself, my term of endearment for myself is Fred. And then I have this cast of characters, kind of like Herman's Head. I don't know if you remember that show. So when I have this internal dialogue, I have this whole cast of characters. So when you said that, I was like, yes, I'm not crazy.
Not at all. I love that. Yes. Right. Like we have this very rich internal dialogue and relationship with ourselves. And I love that you also have a very visual representation of those voices, because I totally go there, and we could take 20 minutes to just like play out that dialogue. So thank you for sharing that. I love it. What about for others?
Dr. Charnin, it was interesting how when trying to locate the below, the just average, above average, how difficult that was. And it was almost like, I don't know, part of me didn't want to think about what I am above average, and because I kept thinking, well, I'm missing it. Maybe I'm just fooling myself thinking that I'm above average in this. And then the other things, it's like, well, am I average there? Is that below average? And how the mind beats itself up, trying to say, no, that's below average. It's not average. And well, no, because I know people like that, and that's most, no, it's below average, so it's bouncing back and forth. But that's interesting. Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that, Mel. Same, right? Like it's such a struggle in terms of like, why do we have such a hard time giving ourselves credit for the things that we do trust, like we're skilled at? Like it's okay to say we're skilled at something. And I notice very similar things with my mind. I'll share with you all something as simple as starting an Instagram account. I was like, I'm not sharing anything new. I'm just sharing some stuff that I read that other people wrote. Like like, and I have a doctorate. I'm like, right, it still activates some insecurities. And so I'll share that too. And I appreciate you sharing that experience, Mel. I imagine you're not alone in that. Does anyone have any questions or anything else to share? I don't want to necessarily keep you all too long, but I'm happy to stay here too. For future reference, is there anything, any questions that you like, any other topics or more that you want to hear more about? I'm always open to creating new resources. So if there's anything that I touched only briefly on and you thought to yourself that you'd really like to know more about it, I would welcome that feedback to either via this format or email or any other form of communication.
I thought you shared really good for us as a staff too, just for how we look at our students in different ways with different mindsets versus the got the name of it. What is the other one? The
fixed in growth.
Yeah, just how it's so easy to get fixed, but then how just as a school and as a staff, we got to look at them with more of a growth mindset. So. I think that would be good too. When we can get back in school, it'd be great for you to share some of this in person with the students. So it's good to try to change the way, I know with my own teenager and with other teenagers, just the mindset that we all have, but especially teenagers, they tend to be down on themselves, especially during this time because they're cooped up. I think we're going to have a lot of things and challenges with mental health going forward as we get back to whatever that new norm is. So we need all your help and your colleagues' helps in how to navigate when we get back together. So this is awesome. Thank you so much.
Happy to. I'll share, I used to work in college mental health, and I also was in VA hospitals. But the college mental health arena and universities is really when we started talking more about mindset. And as you imagine, especially with high achieving, high expectation students or tapping into that shame, this was really helpful to have some of those open, vulnerable dialogues. And we're not necessarily just like one mindset or another. It can flux. So that being said, at any point in time, if that would be helpful for me to even come talk to students or any of my colleagues too, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to.
Definitely, yeah. I think that would be great, because I think it will be a challenge as we get back together what it looks like for all of us. So, you know, I know with my own son, it's difficult at this time with just being cooped up inside, and it's easy to get into bad mindsets and shame and feel bad about what you're doing, not doing, for all of us. So this is great. This is really good. Thank you.
My pleasure. All right, everyone. Well, thank you again for joining, for your time, and honestly, willingness to go through some uncomfortable exercises. I really appreciate it. And please don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you for everyone at TrinityPrep for your time and coordination and just openness. I am such a big advocate for getting mental health out into the schools in a young age. So to be able to share this with you is a really deeply personal and meaningful experience. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Southeast Psych. We really appreciate it, and we couldn't do what we do without you guys. So we really appreciate the partnership and help that you give our families and students and all us as a staff. So thanks.